Welcome to The Scoop, NANP's monthly educational webinar series. I am your host, Andrea Granson, Educational Program Specialist for the NANP. These webinars are recorded, and everyone who registered will receive a link to the replay sometime tomorrow. NANP members can earn 1 continuing education credit for participating in Scoop webinars by taking the corresponding quiz, which can be found in the membership area of the NANP website. Today's webinar will conclude with a Q&A session, so feel free to type in your questions as we go along so that we can get to as many as possible at the end of the presentation. Okay, so let's get started. Today our topic is hives, headache and heartburn. Heal your histamine hangover with Dr. Beverley Rider. After earning her PhD in microbiology and immunology, Beverley served Silicon Valley as a biotech scientist for over 10 years, before becoming a board-certified nutrition consultant at Bauman College. Today, Beverley practices as a nutrition consultant, educating and helping others with histamine excess, anxiety, and migraines. Welcome, Beverley, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Andrea. And thank you to everyone listening. I'm honored to speak with you today about histamine and mast cells in general. And I wanted to tell you that I have no conflicts of interest or sponsorships to disclose. And I'm also super excited about a CEU course that I'm just finishing up that expands on a lot of this material. So without further ado, let's get started. Why am I interested in histamine? Well, besides the fact that it can make you feel downright miserable, I wasn't always interested in it, actually. It was considered old news when I was in my PhD, and I wanted to study something more cutting edge or exciting. But life taught me a lesson, as it usually does. And this is my precious little angel at 3 years old. And here she is swimming in a lot of histamine. I picked her up from preschool, and she had head-to-toe hives. And it really broke my heart, and this really accelerated my interest in histamine. There's a lot more to the story, including years of struggles. It even started at 6 days old with an emergency visit, and I may go into details a little later if there's time and interest. But histamine is a lot more than just allergies. It's a key driver of inflammation in general. And as we know, the chronic inflammation can have many consequences, including diabetes, obesity, and even some malignancies. It affects every body system, and histamine metabolism is nutrient greedy, meaning it uses up a lot of vitamins and minerals in order to metabolize it. And it taxes the liver and the body in general. And histamine and mast cells are actually becoming more important, and the experts are finding links to many other diseases, especially chronic inflammation. And diseases such as IBS or SIBO, EMF sensitivity, or even coronavirus infections, COVID-19. And I'll just go into a little bit on the EMF sensitivity data. I had the privilege of meeting Dr. Ole Johansson at an EMFC conference last year. He's an incredible fellow, and he really opened my eyes to histamine and mast cell involvement and EMF-related effects. He has over hundreds of publications, and based on his studies, he looked at electrical and magnetic waves and their effects on mast cells and release of histamine. And it was really, it was fascinating. I don't have time to get into this today, but it is worth looking into. And the link with COVID-19, there are some reports coming out on mast cells contributing to coronavirus inflammation, and people are looking at anti-inflammatory strategies. We know that mast cells are throughout the lungs and can secrete cytokines involved in cytokine storms. And this is Dr. Afrin. He's a hematologist, oncologist, and one of the pioneers mast cell experts. He has this book published in 2016, Never Bet Against Occam. And here he looks at many case studies and the roles of mast cells and histamine in them. And a lot of them are surprising. And he has this quote that, given the impact of mast cells and histamine in every system of the body in myriad ways, it's given common clinical presentation with multi-system inflammation, odd reactivities, he then ends up with this list of assorted variants of mast cell activation syndrome. This is a partial list, and I won't go into all of them, of course. It doesn't say allergy because allergy is obvious, but underscores where histamine excess or mast cell activation could be lurking. At least it needs to be considered in a lot of these conditions. But what does it look like day to day? Well, histamine can affect people in many different ways, as I mentioned, and here are a few. David, for instance, a chronic allergy sufferer. He wakes up really congested in the morning. His eyes are itchy and red almost all the time, and his nose, his sinuses hurt, and he's constantly blocked up so he can't sleep. It's like an ongoing cold. It just says it's a norm for me now, and he just takes antihistamines. And antihistamines, although they do work, they have some drawbacks, and I'll get into this a little bit later. They can actually make the situation worse. And then there's Amanda with a never-ending migraine. She worked in corporate biotech, and you can find her in her office, and she feels hungover, her head throbbing. Ironically, she feels drunk but doesn't drink anymore. She's ditched many healthy foods that make it feel worse. She's very anxious and irritable and overwhelmed and exhausted with brain fog. And then finally there's Betty, and she's very bloated. After she eats, her belly gets big and bloated. In fact, she was afraid to eat some foods. It's almost like a food phobia of wondering whether it was going to make her feel worse. She was a second grade teacher ready to retire, and one of her students even asked her if she was pregnant, and it really hurt her. And she gets so gassy that when she walked across the classroom, she would let out little toots with each footstep, and she had nausea, burping, diarrhea. It was a really heartbreaking case, and I'll talk a little bit more about these later. But what do these people have in common? Well, histamine is a multitasker, and it's exerting its effects on different systems in the body. For David, it's his respiratory system. For Amanda, her nervous system. And for Betty, it's her digestive system. And here are the areas, the common symptoms due to histamine. For David, it was his airway. For Amanda, his nervous system. And for Betty, her digestive system. There's also cardiovascular signs and symptoms, skin, as well as many, many other symptoms, including menstrual cycle, PMS, and joint and muscle pain. Just go back. So what is histamine? It's a type of biogenic amine. It was synthesized in 1907 and isolated in 1910 from ergot. And this was serendipity because it wasn't actually the ergot, it was a bacterial contaminant that produced the histamine. Histamine is a chemical messenger derived from the amino acid histidine in proteins and is converted to histamine by the enzyme histidine decarboxylase. And the three main effects that I'm going to focus on here are one, the vasodilation. This is where the vessels, the blood vessels, they dilate or widen. Two, vascular permeability, where the cells lining the vessels, they allow fluids and cells of the immune system to leak out of the vessels into a site where histamine is. It's called leaky, and it has actually a link to leaky gut, leaky brain, etc. And smooth muscle contraction. And this you can see in the lung cells in asthma, or also the uterine lining or endometrium. And these are just a few words to describe histamine a little bit more. It's not all bad. We actually can't live without it. And there are too low levels of histamine, which is also unhealthy. But it's also a neurotransmitter responsible for memory and attention. It's involved with stomach acid secretion, so a strong link with digestion. Obviously defense, it's protective, it's ubiquitous, it's quick, it's pre-made and stored and ready to be dispatched. So it's a little like the first domino in a series of immune responses. And if this first domino is tightly regulated, then it prevents downstream immune responses of inflammation. It's very powerful. And it's also confusing. The responses can different symptoms person to person, tissue to tissue, even cell to cell. And then what are mast cells? Well, they were actually discovered over 100 years ago, but for the longest time, no one really knew what they did. They're an important part of the innate immune system. So that the early responders, they produce and store histamine as well as many other mediators inside the granules. As you can see, these dark purple bead-like structures. They are born in the bone marrow and they migrate through the blood to the tissues of the body, and they end their maturation in the tissues where, depending on the type of tissue. So the mast cell type depends on the tissue microenvironment, and that way it's best suited to its environment. And these tissues are in close contact with the environment, such as the skin, the mouth, the nose, the lungs, the gut, looking for what is coming in from the environment. So they stand guard. They're a little bit like the sentinels. And this is a simplified image of the receptors on a mast cell, just to demonstrate the variety of things that can trigger a mast cell. I want to highlight at the top here, we have the IgE receptors that can sense antibody bound to allergens. This triggers allergy, as we best know histamine for, as well as superantigens and autoantibodies in autoimmunity. Then we have the CRH receptor. This senses the corticotropin releasing hormone that is part of the HPA axis that is secreted during stress. So stress has a direct impact on mast cells. And this has been shown to be involved in stress-related rashes and other symptoms triggered by stress. And down here at around 4 o'clock, we have the cytokine receptor that is triggered by TNF-alpha, a strong inflammatory molecule or cytokine. And then we have toll-like receptors. The TLR3 in particular is triggered by viral nucleic acids such as double-stranded RNA. Not shown here are histamine receptors and estrogen receptors. We do know there is a connection between estrogen and what we could actually call histamine. Estrogen can trigger histamine release, and it can also block DAO, which I'll get into, which is an enzyme which degrades histamine. So it's a double whammy. And then histamine can also lead to an estrogen increase. I know this isn't what we all wanted to hear, many of us being ladies, but before you run away, there are other ways that we could balance both histamine and estrogen. And we know if it's a problem if the symptoms are worse around ovulation, days 10 to 14, as well as just premenses. These are the days where estrogen is at a high ratio to progesterone and other hormones. So it's good to check estrogen levels and limit xenoestrogens, such as in plastics. And the vast majority of sufferers are middle-aged women, and it's because when their hormones are starting to fluctuate around middle age, then these symptoms can get worse. So this is, I'd just like to quickly define mast cell activation syndrome. It's recently recognized, and it's a chronic multi-system inflammation where the mast cells release mediators inappropriately. It was first thought to be very rare, around 1%, but the frequency is now thought to be much more, and in fact up to about 17% by some of the mast cell experts. And this is a quote by Dr. Afrin. It's interesting. It talks about this chronic multi-system polymorbidity, and I won't read the whole thing in the interest of time. I love analogies, and I hope this makes sense to you, especially if you have a dog, but you can kind of imagine a chihuahua guarding the front door, and this is the entryway to your body. Say it's the gut, the skin, the lungs, the blood-brain barrier. And if he senses danger, he could bark. And this is like the alarm, the histamine. This alarm can then alert other guard dogs and start this cascade. So this is the first domino. But if danger discontinues, he calms down. And this little dog, he does his job best when he's nourished, well slept, loved, he's healthy. But if this dog is hungry or hasn't slept or stressed, he can become triggered easily and react to multiple things, even shadows, like my dog sometimes does. But there's these innocuous substances, such as pollen, odors, or even some foods that are healthy. They're not bad, it's the reactions. The goal is not to get rid of him, it's to calm him down and nourish him and make sure he's healthy so he doesn't overreact. And it also occurred to me that these mast cells, or chihuahuas, are at the interface of our body and the environment. But our bodies and the environment seem to be becoming more toxic. And these mast cells are a little on edge, or they're becoming more and more overreactive is what I see. And as for interventions, there's medications like over-the-counter antihistamines, like I mentioned, but these don't do anything to the release of histamine or even the amount of histamine circulating. It's just blocking the receptor of the histamine. So it's just blocking the effect temporarily. It's like plugging the ears or silencing the alarm. But we need to ask, why is there histamine? Why are the cells responding or degranulating and not just silence the alarm? Is this trying to tell us something that there's something wrong? So instead of this, positive shifts in diet, lifestyle, and environment would be a far better approach. The other thing I wanted to mention was the antihistamines actually lead to downstream a worsening effect, and I can go into that more. So how does histamine work? We all make histamine and all react given a high enough level. An example of this is scombroid food poisoning. It's also called histamine intoxication. It's when the histamine is made by the bacteria spoiling a fish, or the rancidity. The bacteria have this HDC enzyme that I mentioned that can make histamine, and it's the bacteria on the fish that makes the histamine, not the fish itself. And the histamine intolerance name, there's a lot of controversy and confusion around this name. We're not actually intolerant of histamine, and histamine intolerance isn't a diagnosis, but the way I like to look at it is it's more of like a common denominator or an underlying mechanism of many conditions useful in recovery or knowing which direction to go next. This is a diagram looking at the histamine levels in the gut. Here we have the gut here. These are the gut. This is the gut lining, the gut cells, and this is the blood vessel here. So normally when we eat a meal, histamine from gut ECL cells stimulate acid production for digestion. And once histamine's job is finished, it's quickly degraded by these DAO enzymes. Histamine also comes in from our food and the gut bacteria in the gut that are producing histamine. So in this situation on the left, you have a regular healthy person with good levels of DAO, the degrading enzyme, degrading histamine, and then HNMT, and I'll get into these in the next few slides, degrading histamine inside the cells, and little histamine getting into the blood. In scombroid poisoning that I just mentioned, you get this overwhelming amount of histamine from the spoiled fish, and it overwhelms the DAO enzyme trying to remove the histamine. You have a good level of DAO, it's just not enough to keep up. And the HNMT inside the cells also can't keep up, so you get histamine in the blood, and it causes this food poisoning. It can take from 10 minutes to an hour. And it's these horrible symptoms. I don't think I need to describe to too many of you, but it's about 500 milligrams per kilogram of histamine intake that can cause this. And histamine intolerance is really low DAO, the low enzyme that people have, or either genetically or that they have a downregulation for some reason of making the DAO, and I'll get into that shortly. So even though the amount of histamine is the same as in this first scenario over on the left, the DAO can't keep up, and then you get some histamine in the blood. So which then causes symptoms. So 50 milligrams per kilogram of histamine is the level at which some people can still tolerate. That's the maximum. So less than 50 milligrams per kilogram is where this can happen. So you may have heard of the histamine bucket. This explains the histamine accumulation from multiple sources and how it can add up. So once full, then any added histamine will cause this bucket or this tolerance or threshold to overflow. And ultimately, histamine intolerance is the imbalance between histamine coming in and histamine going out. And what prevents spillover is these enzymes I just spoke about, this DAO, diamine oxidase, and HNMT, histamine N-methyltransferase. And there's many others, but these are the main two. And ideally, you have a healthy range of histamine maintained by DAO and HNMT enzymes quickly degrading. The lack of enzyme activity can be caused by low production due to genetics or gut damage, that they're overwhelmed by, like I just showed you, the histamines or other amines competing for the DAO enzyme, as well as alcohol can suppress DAO synthesis, as well as compete for another enzyme, ALDH, and getting rid of histamine. As well, these enzymes require cofactors and other nutrients such as B vitamins, vitamin C, copper, magnesium, and others. So what are the things that fill up the bucket? What causes excess histamine? It can be numerous. The immune reaction, and these can come from allergies, infections, and other mast cell triggers. Poor gut health due to poor diet, gut damage, antibiotics. Gut health is a huge cause of histamine intolerance and mast cell issues in general. Diet and nutrients, for example, a standard American diet, inflammatory diet, high histamine foods, which we'll get into more. Lifestyle is a huge contributor. Stress, poor sleep, hormone imbalances, as we talked about, environment such as mold, smoke, EMF, chemicals, medications, and painkillers, as well as gene expression. And it's all interconnected, so also the liver, kidney, and overall health play a big role too. I'm often asked, what's the difference between allergy versus intolerance? So if we look at a specific allergy, this is like an acute IgE allergy against peanuts. It's the system involved is immune versus a typical intolerance, such as a lactose intolerant. The system involved is mostly digestive. In acute, it's rapid. It's a rapid response. The triggers can be in trace amount and very specific. And the symptoms can be mainly if it's like a seasonal allergy. This isn't to peanuts necessarily, but inhaled could be sneezing and coughing, or if ingested, digestive hives, and in some cases, anaphylaxis. And I think we all know intolerance can be delayed, and it can vary person to person, and it's really an accumulation to a threshold, a little bit like this bucket analogy. And it's a variable reaction and has digestive upset. So the confusion with histamine intolerance is it can actually be both. It's an intolerance because there's a lack of a degrading enzyme in some cases, actually in most cases, but it's both an immune system and a digestive system issue. It can have a rapid or delayed response. It can take just a trace amount, or accumulate to a threshold, and it can have a wide range of symptoms. And the reason it is another reason it's so confusing is histamine is intimately involved in allergy. We know that allergy is caused by histamine, and the symptoms can look a lot like allergy. I'm not going to go into testing so much because there's no definitive lab test yet, and there's a lot of reasons why not to test. And as nutritionists, we don't diagnose, but it's very confusing. So we do want to give people an idea of whether it's a direction to pursue. So what we can do is use a symptom self-test, which I'll show you. Also a client history. Are there things that are alleviated by histamine blocking medications? Not that we're telling them to take medications, but if they've had that happen, that is a really good sign that it is histamine related. And as well as an empirical test. So if the symptoms are alleviated by reducing histamine or with taking a Dow supplement, then this is a little bit of an empirical clue that it could be histamine. Okay. So that begs the question, are you histamine intolerant? So after looking at many different signs and symptoms, diving into the papers, looking at different questionnaires and talking to people, I boiled down the main symptoms that could give you an idea. And symptoms, as of course, are notoriously non-specific, so it's difficult to pinpoint. But I have a checklist that I put together, and the clients check off if they've experienced these symptoms in the last 3 days. And it's really important to know, to emphasize it's not a diagnosis. First, we have the allergy responses. It's very obvious that these are connected. And then digestive responses, a little obvious that these are connected. This, in particular, heartburn, acid reflux tends to be a problem. And some evidence for this is that the H2 blockers that are taken commonly for heartburn actually block the histamine receptor number 2, and which underscores the involvement of histamine in digestion. Also, there's the skin responses, and even less straightforward is the cardiovascular responses, which do make sense if you think about the vascular permeability and vasodilation. So you get the same amount of blood, or even less blood, in a bigger space. This drops the blood pressure, and the heart has to compensate to deliver oxygen to the tissues. And so when you stand up as well, you can get dizzy. So I hope that makes a little bit of sense. And even less obvious are the neurological, the psychological responses. But at this point, a lot of people ask, well, what doesn't histamine cause? And it is true, because it's so fundamental in so many ways. There's a lot of unusual or other responses. 3 here are the sensitivities to different things like loud noises, to heat, to cold, to odors and fragrances, and a lot of menstrual and issues and muscle pain with fibromyalgia. I actually want to go back and highlight one thing here. Dermatographism is a sign that is actually pretty reliable. Unlike a lot of the other ones, this sign, dermatographism, it really shows that the mast cells are overreacting. This is when you scratch your skin and the skin stays red and irritated long after most people would. And then there's increased risk. So things that increase your risk could include high stress, poor sleep. A lot of us have those in our lives. Feeling worse after taking certain meds or supplements, exposure to mold, toxic chemicals, smoke or secondhand smoke, H. pylori, dysbiosis, gut inflammation, food allergy, sensitivity, poor digestion, hypochlorhydria or low HCl. If you drink alcohol, A restrictive diet, consume few fresh fruits and vegetables, consume high sugar or refined carbs, late night eating, because histamine follows a circadian rhythm and actually peaks in the middle of the night around 2 a.m. So people that have a lot of symptoms when they wake up in the morning, it could be histamine related, candida, hormone imbalance, menopause, and then of course genetic risks. So once the person has finished the test, if they have over half of the boxes checked in any one section, because that one section may be the area of most problem, then excess histamine would likely be a good subject to pursue. And then if they have over 41 boxes in overall the whole test, then it's highly likely. And again, this isn't strict or it isn't accurate, but it's really eye-opening. And the way I use it is, it's the aha factor. When clients go through this, they, oh my goodness, I had no idea that histamine did this, or I get that, I had no idea why that happened. So seemingly unrelated complaints are suddenly linked, and it starts to make sense. And it gives them a little bit of hope that this is connected and it's not random or all in their mind, which is a consistent thing with clients that I see, is that they've struggled for a long time, on average over 10 years, and seen so many different practitioners, and they've just stopped complaining and just started putting up with a lot of these symptoms. Another use could be with the client's food journal, obviously lifestyle, environment, supplements, and meds, tracking all of these. But it's what to look for. It's helping them connect the dots and be mindful of their skin, mindful of their digestive tract or their sinuses. So as they are tracking their foods and reactions, they can look back and try to connect things. They can also retake later to track the progress. And say they have a lot of symptoms in their skin, and if they retake the test after trying to rebalance their histamine, this could be very useful. It also adds clues to which system of the body is most affected, and possibly to the cause. If it's mostly digestive, it could be dysbiosis or gut damage, or there's something else. And now to the recovery. What do we do about it? So obviously I've mentioned a lot of I've mentioned positive shifts to diet, lifestyle, and environment, and I've also put together another checklist, a checklist of tips that are all evidence-based, that can be customized based on that person's suffering. For example, not everyone is going to have histamine problems in the same area, or not everyone is going to eat pickles or eat this, and so it's customizable. If you do this, then this will help. I hope that makes sense. Some are more relevant, and I tell clients to commit to implementing multiple tips in each section, depending on if they feel it's a problem. Because I think each person really has struggled so long that they know intuitively what will help and what won't. And if they don't find improvement, they can continue to check off more on the list. So checklist 1. It's not a typical low histamine diet. These lists are usually lists of good or bad foods, and they're inconsistent from list to list. And I don't think there's a lot of good versus bad foods. It's actually the reaction to the food, or sometimes the storage of the food. And many low histamine food lists don't emphasize and need to emphasize a lot of the following. For example, the ranking of different foods. Sour cream, for instance, has about 7 milligrams per kilogram of histamine. This is pretty low. The average person can tolerate, as I've mentioned, 50 milligrams per kilogram of histamine. So it's put on the same list as some of the cheeses, which can range up to 2,500 milligrams per kilogram. There's in the same category of giving up both of these. So there needs to be more of a range. Also, they don't emphasize unhealthy versus healthy. For example, processed, artificial, and nutrient-poor foods are on the same list as some healthy foods that to eliminate all of them. They don't take into account food quality, processing, storage, which impact histamine levels greatly. And they don't take into account the cause. It could be mast cell activation versus the enzyme inhibition versus low methylation needed for the enzymes versus gut damage. They need to emphasize tracking, diet, lifestyle, and environment. Also the uniqueness of each person. You can't replicate someone else's food regimen for another person. There should be more emphasis on the microbiota and digestive health of the person. This is really key, as well as adding in histamine helpful foods to the histamine unhelpful foods. A little tip I give people is that if you grow a little plant of parsley or basil in your kitchen, you can take little leaves and just eat them throughout the day or add them to meals, and this will naturally bring down your bucket, naturally start emptying your bucket. And there's a wide spectrum of reactivity and thresholds. So you can have someone with mild, infrequent issues that just need to taper back a little bit. And these are most of the people I work with. But there are people with chronic and severe reactions, and they need to be more strict. The low histamine diet needs to be very followed more religiously. And I would really highly recommend that if it's chronic or severe that they see an expert at this point. So food categories of histamine. Rather than memorize what has histamine and what doesn't, I like to have food categories to kind of visualize what is high histamine, and so you don't have to memorize. So there's the natural, there's a large group of foods that contain histamine, or they may not contain histamine down here, independent of histamine content. First of all, there are some foods that naturally contain histamine, avocado, eggplant, tomato, and strawberries. Then there's some that intentionally contain histamine. These are foods that are fermented, aged, or preserved, for example. Champagne is quite high, cheeses, as I mentioned, bacon, deli meats, hot dogs, and then there's unintentional or rancidity histamine contamination. Now this is really the biggest concern here, and this is where the histamine reaction is also, it's also termed histamine intoxication, where bacterial spoilage of a food is very high. So if you eat these, or if a client eats these foods very fresh, then it shouldn't be a problem. It's the time and the temperature of storage that matter. There's independent of histamine content foods. They may contain histamine or may not. And this is really the murky area of the histamine intolerance here, and why list to list or low histamine lists are so variable. There's foods that can trigger histamine release. Alcohol is one, raw egg white, strawberries, citrus, bananas, chocolate's another one, unfortunately, and a lot of food, chemicals, dyes, preservatives as well. There's individual reactions, say peanuts, gluten, or dairy, because these do trigger the mast cell to release histamine, independently of whether they contain histamine. Processed, artificial, and inflammatory foods, food colors, even high glycemic foods that imbalance blood sugar, if that's an issue, can then lead to inflammation, which is a histamine response. And then there's things that slow removal of histamine, mainly alcohol. So checklist one, and I won't go through this too much. I'll actually just go through it so that people have the list if they want to use it or want to read it. Keep in mind, it's a reduction, not elimination of foods, and it's short-term only. About a week, people start to notice a difference usually, but 4 weeks is recommended. The long-term goal is to heal the root cause. remember to read ingredient labels, and eating habits to strengthen digestion and enhance nutrient absorption are very important. Chew, 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 and chew. I can't emphasize this enough. Be mindful, rest to digest, and etc. In the interest of time, like I said, I won't go through all these, but these are really fundamental. I think they're overlooked far too often. And it's hard to tell a paying client to come in and they talk to you and you say, well, you just need to chew and be mindful. They don't want to hear this. They want a list. So these are more tips to minimize processed junk foods. The more processed, the more inflammatory. Alcohol, aged cheeses. Really, I like to put the emphasis on the artificial preservatives, the artificial dyes, the artificial flavors. This is where the emphasis, I think, needs to be, rather than good, fresh, wholesome foods. Also, the storage of foods, leftovers or spoiled foods, the emphasis. And then sugary foods, energy drinks. Also, low-fat diets. People need to go for more healthy fats. And a number of other foods. Now, when it comes to these fermented teas, eggplant, things like this, I don't like to emphasize these too much, as well as many of these possibly reactive foods, because these are healthy for many reasons. And so we start with the unhealthy first. And then foods to emphasize for nutrient-rich eating. More foods to emphasize. I'm going to flip through these quickly in the interest of time. This is a substitution list. Instead of alcohol, water. I know that's not many people are going to actually say, okay. But if people absolutely need alcohol, unfermented, clean alcohols would be vodka, gin, etc. Also, instead of canned, cured, smoked meats and seafoods, fresh meat and seafood, and freeze leftovers right away, etc. How does alcohol increase histamine? I've mentioned this already. It contains histamine. It speeds the absorption of it. It competes for the same metabolic pathway. It slows removal. It can trigger mast cell, also burden the liver. And I have a table here of histamine balancing foods because I want to focus on the positive. Prebiotics, chamomile, ginger, the what, why, and how with some comments. I want to highlight here pea sprouts. They actually produce natural DAO enzyme. And you can actually grow your own. Watercress, broccoli sprouts. Now, checklist 2 is the lifestyle. I don't think I'm preaching to the choir here, so I don't need to emphasize this. But I've combined lifestyle and environment here because, just in the interest of time as well, clean air, and there's some suggestions: clean water, clean exercise, and sleep more and stress less. Easier said than done, but practical tips. More stress less. Go for a walk, tune into nature. This is a big one. Turn off the daily news and turn on uplifting media. Positive thinking. Be happy, not perfect. That's my mantra. Oust chemicals and toxins, mindfulness, and then each other. Find unity and love. There's really supportive relationships, and quality time with friends can be huge. And then supplements if needed. As we know, it's food first, of course, but the food and soil is not as nutrient rich as it used to be. And there's different ways in which supplements can help, as well as foods, but these are the underlying mechanisms. It can be a natural antihistamine, such as vitamin C or bioflavonoids. They can support enzymes to help degrade histamine. They can stabilize mast cells, and support digestion, liver and general health, be an anti-inflammatory and antioxidant. These are some of the mechanisms. And I won't go through these other than to emphasize the flavonoids, quercetin, rutin, luteolin, and many others. This is where, this is the main category I like to emphasize in conjunction with vitamin C. B vitamins are required coenzymes, and the right probiotics is really important because there are many probiotics that can make histamine. They have the HDC enzyme, such as one of them, off the top of my head, is Lactobacillus casei, and I think Dobreckii is another one. And here's some more. Holy basil is a good one. Moringa, wonderful. Again, turmeric, vitamin D if you're deficient or insufficient. A multi-mineral with the copper, iron, and zinc. Iron if your blood test shows you're deficient. Magnesium. SAMe is important for the enzyme HNMT, histamine N-methyltransferase. It has a methyl word in there. It needs methylation. Or DAO enzyme. And I can go more into this. And then I go over the next steps if there's no progress. So if someone is still struggling, there could be some hidden things like hidden allergy, hidden infection, EMF exposure, etc. I talk about intermittent fasting. This is all here if you want to go back and look at it. Low FODMAP and elimination. And then big picture takeaways. So histamine is powerful, multitasking. And histamine tolerance occurs when histamine levels exceed your body's ability to degrade it. Histamine can come from mast cells, and mast cells can become easily irritated with our environment becoming more and more toxic, release histamine too easily. And triggers and causes can, as well as causes, two different things can differ person to person. Symptoms are multifaceted and differ person to person. There's a huge range from mild to severe, acute to chronic, and each person is unique. That's really what I can't express more. And a client often comes in and they talked about symptoms that wax and wane. They just can't put their finger on it. And they're very, very frustrated. And causes are multifactorial too. But the low histamine diets that are all over the internet, they're short term. Rebalancing histamine should be based on root cause. And I didn't go into that too much, but positive shifts in diet, lifestyle, and environment are vital. And histamine is not a panacea. It doesn't mean it's a cure-all, but it is a early domino in many reactions. And if it's slowed down, it can actually prevent many reactions that have a downstream negative effect. It's also well known and can be naturally modified and can relieve many ailments from hives to headaches. And that's it. By the way, it's a little picture of my daughter now without the hives. And I think I finished on time.
That was great. And I probably speak for most of the listeners. You had some amazing slides there. And one of the questions we've got here from Jane is, are they able to get a copy of your slide presentation? So with your permission, when I send out the link to the recording, is it okay if I attach the presentation?
Yes, that's just fine.
Yeah, okay. Because there was some great stuff in there. I know you skipped through some of those. Okay, so Maureen West, she's mentioned here that Dunwoody Labs, they include a histamine and DAO in their advanced intestinal barrier test. Is that something that you're familiar with?
I am. Yes, I've spoken with Dunwoody, and I think they are ahead of the curve in developing these tests. DAO, the thing with DAO is that it can fluctuate quite a bit. But I think if you combine the DAO test, intestinal DAO test, intestinal histamine, and a few other tests, you can get a pretty good picture of what's going on combined with other things. I don't think there's any one test individually that is definitive, but combined, it's going to give you a good enough idea. And even in lieu in the absence of knowing for sure, yes or no, you can go a long way by making some of the positive diet and lifestyle changes to reduce inflammation anyway, which are going to have long-term benefits as well.
Okay, and then Lindsay's asking, can you please explain the cardiovascular response to an allergy with the vasodilation?
Yes. So with, I'm trying to think of best way to explain this. So you have a volume of blood in your vessels, and that volume of blood then oxygenates all the tissues. When you have vasodilation, your vessels widen. These are usually some of the smaller vessels, and leakiness as well. This is where you get your swelling. Your volume of blood inside those vessels suddenly drops because the vessels are widened. So if you think of a compartment or a container with a certain volume of blood, that drops. Now the heart and the cardiovascular system have to work harder to deliver that blood to the rest of the body. And so the heart has to speed up, the blood pressure drops, and often these are the underlying causes of syncope or presyncope, where it can cause fainting, postural orthostatic issues, and it's also some brain fog and headaches due to these vascular changes. I hope that helps. I think that's what the cardiovascular question was looking for.
Yeah, that's a good answer. And Elizabeth's asking, how do we find lists with the amount of milligrams to kilograms of histamine in each food? Is there like a list? Because you mentioned about the cream and the cheese and the difference.
Yes, there are quite a few lists. And lists are different from paper to paper. I can actually attach a list. If you let me just attach a couple of things in this presentation,
Sure.
I can do that before you send it out, and I'll attach a couple of references. But there's such differences. For example, if you take cheddar cheese, the range is from 0 to, I think, 2,000 is milligrams per kilogram of actually cheddar cheese. So you could, it's really Russian roulette. Or it's like, if you eat cheese, it could have 0 or it could have 2,000 milligrams per kilogram. So it's, the variability really comes, and I think this is the main thing, is the starting culture of fermentation. So it's the fermentation species that are used in culturing. So you could have sauerkraut that have 0, or you could have sauerkraut that has 650 milligrams per kilogram of histamine, depending on the starting culture and which bacteria are used and whether they can actually make histamine. But yes, I will attach a couple papers with lists.
That would be very helpful, because somebody else has asked the similar question.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, can you explain a little bit further about how antihistamines lead to worse downstream effects?
Okay. Antihistamines, as well as a lot of other medications, block DAO. This is the diamine oxidase enzyme that is responsible for degrading histamine. So with blocking its degradation pathway, it actually leads to downstream worsening histamine levels. And they don't, I think I already mentioned, I'll just repeat that they simply block the histamine receptor 1, if you're talking about antihistamines like Claritin or other allergy type antihistamines. They block the receptor of the target cell. So it's like plugging the ears to the response, or blocking the response, but they don't affect the actual levels of histamine circulating or the future release of histamine.
Okay, thank you. And yeah, a lot of people here saying this was a great webinar, again, asking for the slides. So absolutely, if you did miss the beginning, of course, we will be sending a recording, a link to the replay tomorrow. We need to just get it converted along with the slide presentation deck. And as a Beverley mentioned some links to the lists. And so I will wrap up the webinar for now.
Okay.
Thank everybody. Thank you so much. That was fantastic. And so next month's presentation will be Nikki Gratrix. She'll be presenting the role of emotional stress in adult onset pyorrhea and how to heal. So please mark your calendars for Thursday, June the 11th. And I'd also like to invite you to share your hot topic or educational piece of material. Are you doing great work in clinical research or applications? Have you started a business or a non-profit, and would you like to share your experience? So if so, NANP wants to highlight all that speaks to our nutrition professional community. So please email me, Andrea, at namp.org. Until next time, thank you everybody and have a great rest of your day. Bye everybody.